Today's speaker is a special friend and colleague with whom I have worked in the field. Kirk Goodrich was an undergraduate here and began, in a sense, in an upstate community in Rochester, New York, in his career, but moved back to New York very early on. In addition to his bachelor's degree, he went on for a master's in planning and went so far as to do a JD. So he's also legally qualified. The beauty of the work we have done together, as you will see in a few moments, has to do with serving constituencies that are local constituencies. The local constituency has to be considered whenever doing any rehabilitation or new construction, but oftentimes lies outside the scope of many projects. Now, for the audience here, you're all coming at it with different points of view in different disciplines, and that's deliberate on my part, certainly, to bring to the campus somebody who is well qualified to answer all of your questions in any number of dimensions. Kirk, welcome.
Michael, thank you so much. It's always great to see you. Thank you for the invitation. Michael and I worked together when I was financing projects, and he was doing historic work, first in Binghamton, and then I think the correct way to describe our work in Harlem is that you rescued that project and the beginnings of my development career. And so I really appreciate, your friendship and support professionally, but also there's never a bad time for me to come back to Cornell. So for me, it was a magical place as an 18-year-old. And so we're just really happy to be here. And Chris, thank you for all the work and coordination. So I can't tell you how important it is to me, and I shared this with Michael last night. Anytime there's a young person or mid-career professional, for that matter, but particularly a young person who wants to understand more about career things or who has questions, I really feel the need to engage and to try to be helpful, and I'll tell you why that is. In the world of real estate, and my current job description is real estate developer in New York City, the world of real estate development is dominated by families, whether they're big firms or small ones, and that's just the way it is. But my father was a plumber and my mother bust trays in a hospital kitchen. Neither of them could help me with my interest in real estate. And the way I was able to advance in real estate was through the good graces of people who weren't relatives or grandparents or parents, but who saw in me some potential and encouraged me. And the only way I could see to repay that is to try to be a resource to people, and young people who might have an interest in being in the field, but don't necessarily have the family connection. So for that reason, the opportunity to talk to you all, both in this setting and outside of this setting, is really important to me. And so I wanna tell you that to start with, so you can understand my frame of reference. So I could talk about any number of things, and the presentation I've prepared is really a jumping off point. But from my perspective, I want you to get what you want out of this conversation. And so I'm happy to go off in a number of directions after I go through the prepared discussion. And so you should feel free to take me far adrift if you wish. So I want to give you some context for what I'm about to share before I do that. I get an opportunity to talk a lot about the work we do at Monadnock in my career. And, I've gotten to a place where we've done so much at the company, and I've had a lot of opportunity to be involved in real estate projects of various kinds, both financing and now developing them. But it's really important for me to convey not only success, but areas where I think as a company or an individual or an industry where we failed. And one of the areas I think we failed is really not unpacking what I call the bundle of goods that's housing. I explained to Sarah and Jennifer and Michael last night that I studied affordable housing as an undergraduate here in the School of Human Ecology. There used to be a major called Consumer Economics and Housing. And so my first classes in affordable housing was really, when I was a teenager still. And I was encouraged by the work of an organization called East Brooklyn Congregations that was rebuilding East New York and Brownsville. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it held some fascination for me. And the hardest part about what I'm about to share is that that we've done in New York a great job of producing housing. But in my opinion, the failure has been in not understanding the very first lesson I learned about affordable housing from Professor Peter Chi, which is housing is a bundle of goods. It's not just the apartment and the home you live in, it's the quality of the school, it's the availability of park space, is whether the neighborhood is safe or not, whether it's close to transportation, are there arts programs, are there recreation programs, are there libraries, is there a good hospital or health care center nearby? And it's such a simple thing, but it's been such a profound failure in our business, both in terms of market rate development and the avalanche of well-meaning activists and community development and affordable housing professionals have missed this simple principle that you could build thousands of units in communities and reimagine and recreate the physical environment and have largely no impact on the future and fortunes of the people who live there. It's a crippling acknowledgement for somebody who spent the last 30 years of my life thinking I was changing the world. And we did, but not enough, not enough. And so I want to talk about 3 projects. I could talk about tons of things we've done. But I want to talk about these 3 projects for 2 reasons. One, because historic projects have always been my favorite and Michael's. I can't remember, a time we've talked about these things that I didn't leave a conversation with Michael more excited and learning more than when I started. The second thing is these projects involved local organizations who I believe got it right, that they fundamentally understood the very first affordable housing concept I learned here all those decades ago, which is housing is a bundle of goods. And so I want to start, that's the context. Hopefully you don't fall asleep. My kids usually give me 5 minutes before they fall asleep. So hopefully we'll do better than that. So this project actually was one that our company, we have 2 companies, Monadnock Construction is a construction company, Monadnock Development, I'm president of, is our development company. We didn't develop this, it was developed by a company called ArtSpace in partnership with another company, organization called El Barrio Operation Fight Back in East Harlem, but we built it. And so that's the image of the completed building there. So I want to give you a little background on our company. Usually in these presentations, after I do this, I take you through slides of all our glossy projects, Not going to do that today. It's a different conversation today. I'm happy to give you the website, but we've done a lot of things. I'll just give you some stats. So since I got there 12 years ago, and maybe in the question and answer, I'll give you some of my background. It was a long and winding road to be a developer. I'll just leave it at that for now. We've done about $2.9 billion worth of development across 46 projects. And we have another $2.2 billion in the pipeline and 20 projects, so we're busy. 71% of these serve low, very low, and extremely low households, and 98% of the projects are affordable and rent restricted. And in New York, that means there's some middle income projects that are restricted. And so we've done 98% of everything we've done has been rent restricted. We've been cutting edge in a lot of ways. I mentioned beforehand to some folks that in the area of passive house, our construction company has distinguished itself. And generally speaking, people are fascinated by modular construction. Our company ran a modular company called Capsis for 20 years, steel and concrete modules fabricated out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We produced about 3 million square feet. Not only single family and townhomes, but multifamily. The micro unit project, which I oversaw for us, was an effort to challenge the city's current position, which a prior position, up until they changed the law in 2016, private developers couldn't build studio apartments or any apartment under 400 square feet. So we produced this pilot project called the Micro Unit Project at Carmel Place, and I think that was instrumental in getting the law changed in 2016. So we're in an age now, we're doing development with BIPOC developers, and faith-based institutions matters a lot. We've been very active in that space. We've done almost 4,000 units with faith-based organizations and have another 4,000 in the pipeline. And then we have a property management company. The points I'm trying to make here is that we've been, by almost any measure, a very successful, robust, prolific development and construction company. So the idea that I'm trying to put forward is we need a new lens to evaluate real estate projects. And I wanted to just bullet point some things that represent the current lens. So these are just things that matter if you're going to talk to an investor or an elected official or my partners or a community board about whether they want to do your project or not. And cap rates, return on equity, yield on cost, equity multiple, IRR, whether it's passive house or LEED, certainly matters. 100% electric, which we're doing a 2,000 unit development in East New York, which will be 100% electric. Whether it's affordable, how affordable, is it affordable to the people who live in that neighborhood? This is an ongoing conversation because in New York City, in particular, the area median income that really governs affordability that's published by HUD includes surrounding areas that are more suburban. So the question about whether a property is affordable to the people who live there, whether you're creating a gentrifying effect, these are really important questions. BIPOC development activity, ownership, co-ownership by BIPOC developers, that's important. And then all corporations have an ESG policy now. It doesn't mean they're actually doing the things that they need to do, but everybody has a statement about what it means for them. So why do we need a new lens? And I say we need a new lens because huge segments of the population in many communities are still being left out and left behind, which is the preamble I shared with you at the beginning. And then the concept is if housing is a bundle of goods, poor communities of color and rural communities often have an inferior bundle. And so I just give examples here. Education disparity, wealth disparity, drug addiction. When I was growing up in Brooklyn in the 1980s, in the 80s in the inner cities, it was crack. And in rural communities, suburban communities, the opioid crisis has really been a reminiscent of what we went through in urban communities in the 80s with crack, just devastating communities in a way that no one could have predicted. Crime and gun violence. I often say, when people think about young folks being radicalized, we've been trained to think about that being radicalized means is related to Islam. The truth is, when I think about it, I think about young men of color being radicalized by gang activity in the inner city. And I think about folks in the rural parts of the country being radicalized by militia, et cetera. So I think crime and gun violence among our young people is a major concern in inner cities and outside of inner cities. Mass incarceration, unequal access to arts education, underfunded arts, cultural, and recreational institutions, substandard and fewer arts, cultural, recreation spaces, poor health outcomes, poorer consumer services. And so I bullet pointed these things to really just dramatize when I say an inferior bundle of goods, I want to be very specific about what I'm talking about. So, you know, the three projects I want to focus on, the Fortune Academy, which is a project I worked on beginning in the late 90s, which really transformed an old girls Catholic school into affordable housing and a service hub for prisoner reentry led by the Fortune Society. The second project is the Boys and Girls Club of Harlem. We call it BGCH Apartments, which is a project that I worked on beginning around 2012, which really created affordable housing and a new headquarters for the Boys and Girls Club of Harlem. And then PS 109, which was the transformation of an old public school into affordable artist housing, gallery space, studio space, et cetera. So I want to point out that all three of these projects are in Harlem. So this is 630 Riverside Drive in West 140th Street. That's Fortune Academy. Not far away on 145th between Broadway and Amsterdam, Boys and Girls Club of Harlem. And then down here in East Harlem, East 99th and 3rd Avenue, PS 109 Art Space. So I'm going to start with my favorite project. And incidentally, as I always tell folks, this project is transformative in a few ways, but one of our least successful financial projects. So if you judged it based on return on equity, IRR, yield on cost, almost any economic, cash flow, almost any economic metric, we would not have done this project. From a construction perspective, let's pretend we weren't developers and we just wanted to look at whether we made money on construction, you would not have done this project. So this is a very clear example of one where there was only marginal economic benefit to pursuing it, but its impact on the community and the young people, in particular in the community, has been profound. So I'm going to tell the story that, how I got involved in this and what happened. So the Boys and Girls Club of Harlem was launched by Pastor M.L. Wilson in a small part of his church at Convent Avenue Baptist Church, a few blocks away. And they were housed in about 3,000 square feet. And they bought this abandoned public school, which was Public School 186, around 1986 or so, and thought they were going to do a headquarters. But the execution of the renovation of a building of this scale was really not something they had the resources or sophistication to do. So it sat empty from 1986 until we eventually did it, roughly 28 years later. I got involved when I was working for a company called Enterprise Social Investment Corporation, which was connected to a company which was called Enterprise Foundation, created by the urban planner, developer, Jim Rouse. How many people here have heard of Jim Rouse? Raise your hand. Okay. So Jim Rouse created Enterprise Foundation, and when I was there, I ran the New York City area and then ultimately the Northeast. And someone approached me about considering a refinance. And so we contemplated doing it, went through a process to get approvals, and then somebody on the board of the Boys and Girls Club decided that we're going to go in a different direction. That was around 2007. So nothing happened for several years. And then around 2012, they came back and said, what do you think we should do here? And I said, we ought to do historic credits. The only problem is the developers involved at that point had spent the ensuing 3 or 4 years since I wasn't involved convincing SHPO that it would not be a good idea to make this project historic. And so when I got involved and we started to work with a company called Datton Architects on those conversations, they said, SHPO's confused. They thought, this didn't have the architectural and historic significance. And so we had spent a fair amount of money at that point, and I didn't know what to do. Saying I was desperate probably would have been an understatement. So I called Michael, and I asked Michael if he would think about taking this on to kind of move it ahead. And he jumped in, had the conversations we needed to have, and more importantly, did the work to understand what the opportunity was here to preserve an important piece of the history of the neighborhood. And so part of the problem we had wasn't only the work that was done beforehand where they tried to convince SHPO that it didn't have the appropriate significance, but look at the state of the building. The upper floors had collapsed. It was a real disaster. And so our construction team really didn't want to do this. And so we were able to work with Michael, move this forward, and get the financing we needed, and get it closed and renovated. And here's the finished product, which we opened, I think, in 2016. It's one of the things I'm most proud of because it was uphill, not only with the community, but with my partners. It was the first time I had been at Monadnock in 2010 and started as a developer. It was the first time I really used any capital I had with my partners to advance something that didn't really have a pure economic benefit. And fortunately, they embraced it. I'm going to walk you through some images, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the compelling work the Boys and Girls Club actually does. So this is the front view. This is the courtyard view, looking straight back, those 3 doors. This is how it looked when we started. That's the completed project. This is a stair and a hall. This is the completed project. This is a small space that was, I think, Michael, you indicated it was used for recording music on the 4th floor. The problem with this space is that in the completed building, it sits in the middle of a residential hallway on the 4th floor, and the restoration of it was not a non-negotiable item. And so the picture above shows what we started with and then what we ended with. It's just a beautiful space. Can folks hear me okay? Great. And this is the 1st floor. So this is a H-shaped building. It fronts 145th Street and it goes through to 146. The residential lobby and entrance is on 146. 145th is a major thoroughfare. That's where the entry is for the Boys and Girls Club. And the Boys and Girls Club occupies about 9,000 square feet on the first floor. Above that, there are 78 affordable units with 14-foot ceilings. And they serve kids from the ages of 5 to 18 in this building. And so that's the Boys and Girls Club lobby. That's an indicative classroom. And then this is a view of one of the apartments. So the Boys and Girls Club is a fascinating organization. They focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, education for kids at young ages. They do after-school programming. They have 6 sites where they serve 1,200 kids a year. They do college readiness and connection to academic institutions, secondary ed, et cetera. It's an amazing organization that has been really active in Harlem for many years, and this is the hub of their activity in this building. Next slide. So art space. So we didn't develop this building, but we built it. One of the things that I've really been focused on more and more is creating space for artists. So there's a lot of reasons for that. Early in my career, I worked in Philadelphia and had the opportunity to interact with an artist by the name of Lily A, Village of the Arts and Humanities. Has anybody heard of Lily A, Village of the Arts and Humanities? There's a documentary that I would recommend produced by her son called The Barefoot Artist, which is just amazing. And she was an unbelievable artist with talent to do almost anything she wanted, went to University of Pennsylvania, and could easily have sort of disappeared into the really successful world of being a commercial artist, and instead decided she was going to work in one of the worst neighborhoods in North Philadelphia, and created something called Village of the Arts and Humanities. Separate than that, many years later, I made 2 trips to Cuba and toured the work and the community that the artist Jose Fuster created. And over time, it became apparent to me when I looked at our communities that arts education, access to arts facilities, gallery space, black box theater, rehearsal space, all were areas where we really weren't doing a great job in communities of color and low-income communities. And what's been apparent for many years is that early access to arts and arts education is a fairly reliable predictor of long-term education success and professional growth. Teamwork, perseverance, confidence, creativity. There are a myriad of things that access to arts education at an early age, creates. And so from my perspective, as I've sort of looked at these things, I suggested to folks in the city that they create a Percent for Art program for affordable housing. And so the folks at ArtSpace were way ahead of me. And so they created this building, which I think opened in 2015, which created affordable housing for artists and included gallery space, et cetera. And so I want to walk you through some of the images of the building. So this is a typical apartment. What's interesting about several of these apartments, in addition to the scale and the ceiling heights, is that often they have an extra space, 100 to 120 square feet, for studio space. So it's supposed to be a live-work environment. It's the kitchen. This is the lobby area, hallways. And this is the area of the building that is one level down from the lobby, but it's a massive space that folks have commandeered and used for performances and a variety of things. The last group or project I wanted to talk about is the Fortune Academy. And so The Fortune Academy is a project that I was involved in 1999, but the organization that created the Fortune Academy is called the Fortune Society, and what they do specifically is prisoner reentry. So they look at the fact that when people come out of jail, they're disconnected from family, disconnected from education options, from the employment sector, they're housing insecure and food insecure, and so they've done a terrific job at really facilitating that. What I wanted to do was share a YouTube video. It's 3 minutes because I think it's important enough work. And the one thing I'll say, I gave a stream of consciousness rant before I came in and when I was having lunch with a few students about the difference between activists and folks who organize and get things done. How many are familiar with if you live in New York State, I'm sure you can't miss it, but the conversation around bail reform, people familiar with that conversation. And the idea is that folks of color in particular have been disproportionately incarcerated for fairly minor nonviolent offenses, and the need to really focus on getting a justice system that's restorative to people rather than incarcerating is important. The only problem with that is there's a vast difference between a policy objective, a legislative objective, and actually execution. And as future planners, architects, developers, we are in the detail and execution business. We are not in the conversation business. And the problem is at a fundamental level, the people who are having the conversation about bail reform and our criminal justice system never have spent the time to figure out what it actually means to integrate folks back into society and to do it in a systematic way. And there are models for it. And so there's a conversation, a high-level conversation without details, and then there are people on the ground doing the work. And so I wanted to play this video. It's very short, it's 3 minutes.
If you want to know how to reduce crime in America, in New York City, you do it one person at a time, creating an environment that celebrates the human spirit. Recidivism is a result of societal failure to do that, and Fortune has demonstrated that lives can change.
I tell people all the time, this is where I grew up. This is where I learned what being a man is and what being a productive citizen means.
It is the work of this great organization that has helped to shape my ideas, drive my conviction, and further deepen my commitment to the cause.
For more than half a century, you have amplified the voices of those who are impacted by unfair policies and helped thousands of justice-involved people transform their lives. You have led by example to show how we can help formerly incarcerated individuals come home, rebuild their lives, and contribute to our communities.
It's never about the contract or the milestones first. It's always about the individual. These individuals were literally suffering in incarceration because they just didn't have an address to go to. And for them to walk into a place where it's about them and only them and what they need and only what they need.
There's one person in particular, he came through our programs and he ended up opening his own construction company, and he came back to Fortune and said, I want to hire people from here, and it was like about how if you lift one person up, they lift others. Even if it's just one person that this happens to, it's worth it. And I know that it's not just one person, it's many people.
COVID-19 worsened existing barriers to reentry. Reentry is hard enough as is, but even harder during a pandemic. As people were released from Rikers early due to COVID-19, our services and housing were needed even more.
Fortune Society has kept their doors open during the pandemic. We offer them incentives when they arrive to the community, as well as refer them to specific resources. And we also host our workshops virtually where the clients are able to remain engaged. And we also launched our care package program, and where we were able to provide over 200 care packages with toiletries to clients that were released into the community.
Fortune's mission is more important than ever. It's a two-pronged mission. The service part is about being there for people as they rebuild their lives after experience in the criminal justice system. And as we give our services, we see the barriers that people face, and we do fierce advocacy about job discrimination, housing discrimination, conditions of confinement, and all of the albatrosses that are hung around the necks of people as they finish their time and try to build new lives.
Fortune Society is at the forefront of hope and lasting positive change.
Before we go through the remaining of the presentation, I want to say a few things about two of the people. So David Rothenberg, who founded the Fortune Society, was a Broadway producer and had great success. And somebody presented him a script on being incarcerated, and he got involved in the prison and reentry world and created the Fortune Society. Joanne Page, who's who's the woman with the small afro you see at the end, Joanne began visiting prisons with her parents and dialoguing with inmates when she was 18, went to Yale Law School, graduated, and instead of going into a firm or a traditional path, ended up working for the Fortune Society and now running it. I consider one of my heroes. The amazing thing is we're talking about a population that most folks would want to see just disappear. And the problem is that we have a situation where there's enough people incarcerated and there's inequality around it, and people need to be engaged in reentry, whether we like it or not. In my world, I always talk about the high road or the low road to morality. The high road is we do things because it's the right thing to do. The low road is if you don't do something about it, the problem is going to show up at your doorstep. And however you get there, the reality is the work of the Fortune Society is critical work. I got involved with them because they bought this building, which was until 1957 a girls' Catholic school, and then various other things, and then ultimately, I think in the 80s, abandoned. It sits right above the West Side Highway at Riverside Drive and West 140th Street. The Fortune Society bought the parcel and the land behind it, and then wanted to do a project. In 1999, I was a year into my career at Enterprise, hadn't done a lot of tax credit projects, and they came to us wanting to have us work on this. And there were a lot of problems. First of all, the economics really didn't work. We had to cobble together historic credits, low-income housing tax credits, homeless housing assistance money from the state. But the larger problem was the folks who lived along Riverside Drive and West 140th Street, the last thing they wanted to see was 62 formerly incarcerated people living on that block. There's 62 beds in there. And it was Joanne who took the time over several years to meet with people, to talk to them, to allay their concerns, to educate them, which none of those things are development tasks. It was really about using her powers of persuasion and really inspiring and educating and creating a better understanding in order for people to embrace the project. And I'm sure not everyone did, but we were able to at least get momentum around getting it done. I still, to this day, I've been involved. I think I financed about 12,000 units of housing when I was at Enterprise, and we've done about 9,000 units since I've been at Monadnock. And of all the projects I've worked on, there's only one I have a picture of on my shelf, and it's this one. And it's because of what it took to get us across the finish line and what it meant to do a project for people no one cared about. And then the fact that the project is as prominent as it is in terms of its location and renovation, all those things taken together just made it really compelling for me. So I don't have many images of this. I had a lot of images, I don't, but I think you get the idea. It's just an unbelievable building. That's when it was St. Walburga's Academy. This is the abandoned building with the Fortune Academy folks sitting outside. And this is the completed building, which is visible from the West Side Highway and has become a fixture in the neighborhood. You can see it a little bit in this picture, but after we finished this building, Joanne and the Fortune Society partnered with the developer Jonathan Rose and created a second building on the parking lot behind to do more homeless housing and affordable housing. And that's just another image of the Fortune Academy. So the theme of today has really been creating a new lens to look at real estate projects. And the focus is on creating communities that are places that we'd like to live. This is a simple concept. When we decide where we rent an apartment or where we live with our families, there are things we look for. And I've had this conversation a few times. We want a great place to shop. We want good schools. We want good recreation. We want to be safe. We don't want to commute far to work. And the question I always ask folks in the affordable housing world who are focused on safety nets only is, why would you think poor folks want something different or less than you? The debate in the affordable housing world has always been around safety nets or elevators. And I wrote a piece called, "We Need an Affordable Housing World That's About Elevators, Not Just Safety Nets." And in a climate, particularly in New York, where we have more than 62,000 people in homeless shelters, asylum seekers coming into the city, particularly during COVID, fairly grinding poverty. In our housing authority, we have 170,000 units, mold and other issues, which the city's working hard to resolve, but there are a lot of people struggling. The inclination of policymakers and elected officials is to focus in a laser-like way on safety nets. And there's a logic to that. But the truth of the matter is that we need elevators. We need policy, program, and development that's also focused on elevating people. I call those programs elevators. And so the spirit of this conversation about looking at development as creating a better bundle of goods is really reminiscent of the conversation around elevators and safety nets. And so in my mind, I've just done some bullet points here. Federally qualified health centers has been a staple in many communities, really important. I've listed these as things that when we look at development opportunities and we are doing a large residential project and we have unused community facility floor area, what can we do? And federally qualified health centers, charter schools, we've done one of those, multi-purpose recreation and wellness center. In the Armory in Crown Heights, there's a 260,000 square foot multi-purpose recreation and wellness center. It's been transformative to that community. Performing arts centers, galleries, rehearsal spaces, university community partnerships. This is something that's near and dear to my heart because I started my career with Professor Reardon here, actually graduated from here, and then in Illinois on the East St. Louis Action Research Project, really leveraging the resources of a university to partner with local communities to see change happen. Nutrition, food pantry, benefits hub. We're partnering with the Campaign Against Hunger in Brooklyn to really look at housing and food insecurity in a different way. Reimagine public education with industry-specific focus. This has been something the current mayor is focused on in New York, to actually train folks for jobs that exist, that are good-paying jobs in growing industries. It seems obvious, but it's not done. Career and industry-focused education models, I mentioned that. Intentional partnership with faith-based and community partners. When you go into communities that are poor and under-resourced, often the only institutions left there are faith-based institutions. And we've seen in East New York and Brownsville and other parts of the city, much of what we've done has been with faith-based partners. And then the extension of public-private partnerships. When people think about public-private partnerships, they're often talking about finance mechanisms, but I actually use that term to describe other partnerships that larger, institutions can partner with local institutions and create opportunity. I could talk about 100 different things, and sort of this is what's on my heart and mind today, but I want to stop there. And one, I want to say thank you for the opportunity, but also, I'm okay talking about almost anything you want to talk about. And so I want to open it up to folks right now, and feel free to, tell me what you're thinking about, any questions you might have.
On. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Great talk. Two questions. One is about, you said your projects are 100% electricity fueled. Is that a New York City choice, or is that your choice? And the second question, you've obviously used the term affordable units repeatedly, because that's obviously a major focus of your work. In New York City at this time, what does it cost to rent an affordable unit or to purchase an affordable unit? So two questions.
Absolutely. So thank you. So with respect to the first question, the evolution to a place where we do buildings that are 100% electric, which we have our currently the project that is going to be all electric is a 2,000 unit project, which is going through finishing rezoning now and will be built hopefully beginning a year and a half to 2 years from now, and will take us probably 8 to 10 years to build out.
So that's not a New York City.
That is a New York City project, but it's not built yet.
Requirement of New York City, or is
no? So here's the thing. And I had this conversation earlier. So there is a local law in New York that takes effect a few years from now that anticipates that requires buildings to migrate to being all electric. The reality is there's an exemption for affordable housing. But here's the story, and I talked about this a little bit with students earlier, which is in New York we have a climate of a really progressive architecture community, a really sophisticated development community, very focused political environment that and climate change is probably matters more in places like New York than in a lot of other places. And so the city, in terms of financing projects through the various agencies, has been extremely supportive of sustainability for more than a decade now. In fact, when I was at Enterprise, they launched the Enterprise Green Community, which became a standard for sustainability across the country, and has been for probably 15 years now. So if you're applying for tax credits in almost any state, the Qualified Action Plan typically the sustainability requirements in the qualified action plan that governs LIHTC projects is almost certainly enterprise green community. And so we're in a climate now where, and really have been for a while, where staying ahead of the curve on sustainability is sort of a fundamental area to compete. And so if you're a developer and you're competing in an RFP, or you're having conversations with city agencies about resources, and you're not really focused on these things, you can't be competitive. That's just the way it is. And so the second part about affordability, so the housing agencies in New York are very specific about what they require programmatically. And in New York, the dominant program for rental production, the production of rental affordable housing through New York City Housing Preservation and Development, which is the housing agency, and New York City Housing Development Corporation, which is the bond agency, is a program called the ELA program, which was launched under de Blasio, but truthfully it existed in iterations before called something different. And it's really focused on making sure that 50% of all affordable housing that's rental is rented to folks who are extremely low, which is extremely low and very low, which is all under 50% AMI. So right now, very, very low for a family of four would be 50% of, I think the area median income is like 130 grand or so. There was a spike for 2022. So I don't know all the rent numbers off the top of my head because we use pro formas, but the tension exists because the affordability levels as defined by HUD incorporate areas of the metropolitan area that are higher income. And so it skews the affordability and the rents to a higher level than most poor communities in New York City, can afford. And so that's really been the tension. And so when you negotiate for a property that is not entitled and you're going through a discretionary process, much of the conversation is around making sure you lower rents and make it affordable to folks in that particular neighborhood community board. In fact, in most places, it is the central part of the negotiation. This is a really fancy auditorium. I expected like the mics to drop out of the ceiling tiles or something like that.
Mr. Goodrich, thanks a lot for coming to speak with us. This has been a really interesting talk. I'm stricken by how like the two of the three projects you describe were on the sites of abandoned schools. I'm from Portland, Oregon, and like a lot of the, like I know a lot of schools in Portland's like Central East Side have also been closed down and redeveloped for other purposes, like a hotel or like community spaces or restaurants and that sort of thing. And I'm curious, like, could you speak a bit more about like the particular challenges of like developing on these sites for what used to be like what used to be an educational space, and like in terms of like, is there any infrastructure that you need to kind of like build around like, or like legacies in the community, and like how does Monadnock Development approach that?
So I just want to make sure I understand your question. So typically, our city and many large cities where there's high demand are land constrained, and so the adaptive reuse of places like this is sort of central to sort of being able to move forward with your development business. Our company, for example, needs to do 3 to 5 projects a year in pre-COVID to actually run our business. And so one is just a pragmatic consideration of moving ahead with stuff. In terms of community constraint, I just want to make sure I didn't fully understand the sort of the context of what your question was.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Like, I guess So yeah, creative reuse of environments, that's like a really important facet for any city to address its housing issues. But like, are there particular challenges that come with like working on like on the sites of old schools? Like,
Yeah, so two major things, which came up on this, but it's indicative of, so the buildings are extraordinarily inefficient. So we got 78 apartments in like 100,000 square feet, which is like I mean, for us, when we looked at the efficiency, it was like 55 or or something like that. Our typical new construction building has an efficiency of like 70 to 75%. And so it's terribly inefficient, which actually the number of units we got in this space is part of the reason why economically it will never approach the success of other projects we had. Second problem is just a practical consideration of essentially the units conform to, and we had this in Binghamton too. Basically, a classroom is a unit more or less, and you end up with these odd apartments that are really large spaces. In fact, we had a whole conversation around trying to create rooms. And trying to do that, we ended up having apartments that were studio apartments that were larger than a lot of one-bedroom apartments in our other buildings. And so the efficiency of the overall building and unit count, the inefficiency of the sort of these in the oddness of the spaces, but also in terms of heating and cooling. We had meetings through COVID around just heating and cooling of the apartments that have 14-foot ceilings. People didn't realize what it would actually cost. And then the last thing is what is your heating and cooling system of choice when you don't want to perforate the building facade? And like in many of our buildings, we see a VRV type system, no P-tax. I think in the Boys and Girls Club one, we had baseboard heating, but no through window air conditioning. So there's a lot of problems with the adaptive reuse of these buildings for residential. But we navigate them and deliver them, but almost without exception, none of them perform economically even close to what our new construction buildings do.
all right, thank you so much for the detailed answer.
Mr. Goodrich, thank you. Just wanted to say I remember in 2005 when you were with Enterprise Partners and you came in and spoke in Rolf Pendle's affordable housing class. Oh. So Ken Reardon's also, a friend of mine. He's my advisor and most recently was in Memphis because of him. So right. I have two questions. One, if you could speak a little bit about the 421A tax credit and maybe how that skewed housing development. I think maybe a little disproportionately to private developers.
Okay.
And then the second one is sort of I've been in the Crown Heights neighborhood since 2005. So that Bedford or Crown Heights Armory, which is now I think what Major Owens Community Center, did face some community pushback, and I think ultimately has resulted in on the east side, a big apartment complex, and then south of that, I think it's lined with market-based townhouses. Mm-hmm. But they've done some incredible work, although I'm just wondering if you're aware of any of the sort of community complexities in getting
absolutely.
the project done.
So so I want to tell me your name?
Peter Jenkins.
Peter. So I want to first thank you for the question. So I want to give folks an appreciation for what Peter's talking about. So 421A is a tax. You can't do affordable housing, almost any kind of housing, particularly in New York or any place else, without a pilot, which is a payment in lieu of taxes, or a full abatement of some kind. And so in New York, there was only one path for a non-discretionary, as of right, property tax abatement, and that is through for residential projects, and that was through the 421A program. And so the 421A program enabled a developer to build market rate rental housing while committing 25 to 30% of the units to be affordable. And then there are different options in terms of affordability. But the bottom line is that tax abatement expired in June of this year. And so right now in New York City, there is no as-of-right tax abatement. Now, I'm going to give you very quickly, I'm going to give you two sides of the issue. The first side of the issue is that it's a giveaway to wealthy developers, that having a property tax abatement for building luxury rental housing, even if a portion of it is affordable, is a not acceptable outcome. And so we shouldn't restore it or create a replacement program, anything like it. I'm going to give you the opposite side of that, which I began to get at in an op-ed I did in the Daily News, which ran this past Monday, I believe. New York is grossly undersupplied. We have a historic vacancy rate of 2%, which is far too low. And so my position is really two things. One, like I asked the elected official, did you take Econ 101? So we need a housing supply at every income level to address the low vacancy. And so even rental housing for higher incomes helps to address it. Secondly, New York's best, and some say only, fair housing strategy, I wouldn't say only, but it's certainly, I think, the best, is the creation of affordable units in high opportunity areas. And that happens through the 421A program, because the luxury buildings get built in the best neighborhoods with the best schools and best shopping and everything else. And you have families who are low-income families who are able to live in those neighborhoods. And that creates diversity and access in a way no other fair housing initiative in the city does. So it was really the principal fair housing strategy, in my eyes, that the city had. And so when you eliminate 421A, an undersupply of 500,000 to 800,000 apartments doesn't get better. It gets worse. It exacerbates it. And secondly, tell me what your fair housing strategy is in the absence of it. So that's how I would answer that. The second point is that this particular project, which Peter refers to, was contentious for two reasons. One, because it created luxury housing on a public site in Crown Heights, an area that people feel has been gentrifying for some time. And then at least one of the developers involved had some issues and had to exit the project. And so I think the outcome of the activism around it was a public, I think a community benefits conversation that yielded, among other things, a 264,000 square foot recreation and wellness center, which in my eyes might be the best indoor recreation and wellness center in the city, in a former armory building. It's a beautiful, in my mind, a beautiful adaptive reuse. And so there are still folks who I'm sure are not happy with the affordability level, but my answer to that would be the same answer I gave to the last point. And the outcome of it for folks, I mean, there are people in there, there's swim classes in there, indoor soccer. It's staggering. It's a staggering asset to the community in a way that you wouldn't see in a neighborhood like Crown Heights, in a city as land constrained as New York. It's a unbelievable accomplishment in my eyes.
Hi, I wanted to ask, how do you get in touch with your partners? How do you learn about the projects? And then also, after the completion of a project, how does Monadnock remain involved in some way?
Right. So when you say my partners, you mean my actual partners at Monadnock, or you mean my larger community partners?
Community partners.
So it's a great question. So I'm in a unique situation. As I was telling Michael and Sarah and Jennifer last night, I kind of grew up in the affordable housing world in New York. Like being involved in affordable housing is literally the only thing I've ever wanted to do. Never wanted to be a fireman or a doctor or whatever little kids want to be. And I'm still doing it. And, whereas, some people, follow athletes or entertainers or, people like, tech billionaires, I was always a groupie for nonprofit housing and community development people. Like my personal heroes are the people I've been working with the last 30 years. I read about the work of East Brooklyn congregations and Mike Geekin and Dr. Reardon and many others who run nonprofit organizations, Asian Americans for Equality, Community League of the Heights, Mid-Bronx Desperados, and on and on and on. It was I was in school reading about, I think my generation might have been the first generation where you could actually read about community development work, which I consider the community development work done through community development corporations and the affordable housing work. I think my generation might have been the first generation that could actually read about that work and become it. And I did that. I was learning about now community land trusts are a big deal, social housing, and I laughed because I was having a conversation with somebody who's an activist and some elected officials, and I was like, so I first learned about social housing and land trusts when I was a teenager, and I'm 54 now. So if you want to have a conversation about it, happy to do that. But this is stuff that I sort of bled. And so it was those relationships when I got to New York and through Enterprise started doing all these transactions in all these neighborhoods, Harlem and Bed-Stuy and Bushwick and East New York and Brownsville and all over the Bronx and Washington Heights, Jamaica, Queens, thousands and thousands of units. So those relationships are my primary relationships. And so the partnerships, to create them is a simple thing because those are text messages or calls. And those relationships go beyond a particular project. They are life relationships, my principal business relationships. And so that's very, very different than the typical developer who said, wow, Harlem is an unbelievably good place. We could do market rate housing there. And they go to Harlem, they've never worked there, and they look in a directory or ask somebody who the best organization is, and they call them up cold or whatever, or get a political consultant to introduce them. And the first time they're hearing about organizations is when they meet them to do a project. I'm as far away from that dynamic as possible. I've been in the world of affordable housing and community development my whole career. So those conversations are, there's a level of trust and engagement that's different. And so those relationships are, for me, eternal. Like they're everything. And so that's why I'm really focused on this question of, did we do enough? Could we have done better? Because when you spend your life doing something and you think you did a good job and you find out a lot of the communities aren't where you think they ought to be, it's a crippling acknowledgement, but it's also an occasion to revisit.
Hello, Kirk. Thank you very much for your presentation. So I have two questions. The first one is, actually, I agree with that. The typical economical perspective of capital return is quite limited. Actually, all these social impacts, positive social impacts are invaluable. So I want to know for these very great projects, affordable housing projects, I think they are quite expensive. So I want to know, are there any specific policies or financial approaches in New York State to support these projects in long term? This is my first question. My second question is, so because it's very expensive, so you also mentioned the public-private partnership model. So when these kind of projects introduce the private sectors, how we can balance the conflicts between the private profits and the public interest?
Right.
Thank you.
I think both great questions. So the first question is, I think the biggest critique, particularly in California, when you see, there was an article, I think, in the Times about homeless units costing $700+ a unit. The biggest concern I have, and it has been for a long time, one of the biggest concerns is how expensive, and particularly in cities like New York, given our labor costs and the cost of land, and questions about delivering to construction workers a living wage, and sustainability, and the focus on making sure we're reducing high design, because everybody feels like if we're going to put poor people and working class people in buildings, they need to look good. So when you add all of that together, right, all of those independent things together, which are all important independently, right? Land costs what it costs. We want to pay people a living wage. We want to make sure that we're building quality housing. We want to make it sustainable. When you all add those independent things together, you end up with astronomical, 500 to 600 a square foot. And from my perspective, for and then you talk about doing micro apartments or buildings with lots of studio apartments for homeless individuals. The standard program for homeless individuals in New York, permanent supportive housing, was studios. And what's incredible is that's far more expensive than family housing. When you look at, if you have a 100,000 square foot building with all 400 or 300 square foot studios, the intensity of the mechanical use is astronomical. And so I feel like the underside, or the unspoken issue, is expense of these buildings. And how do you justify it in a climate where people are suffering? Can we build cheaper? Can we build better? And can we afford to keep doing this? And honestly, it's an ongoing issue. And the city of New York commits on average about $1.5 billion a year to permanent affordable housing, and another $3 billion to house homeless families and to prevent families from being homeless. It's a mind-numbing amount of money that, given our fiscal climate, folks always question, is it sustainable or not? So the first question, there really is no answer to that. It's just what it is. But it's troubling. And then the second question is, most of you probably realize, you've been reading the newspapers, the entry of large real estate private equity into purchase of single family homes and affordable rental portfolios is staggering. So Blackstone launched, I guess a year or two ago, a platform called April Housing, which is run by a woman named Alice Carr, who used to be at Chase and has 90,000 units. And of course, they say all the right things. And I think you have to give folks a chance, and there are other folks who have platforms like that. The problem is, when we work in communities and we've picked financial partners who are large institutions, we have to make sure they share our values. And that's important because there are always going to be moments where the decision, where the financial decision, the expedient financial decision, is in conflict with doing what's right for residents. And it happens really often on a small scale in our buildings. And it will happen in a large way as well. And no one is confident that those large companies will come down in the right place, under these circumstances. And I want to be clear: there isn't. They haven't. A lot of those firms haven't done anything to date to lead us to believe they will make the wrong decisions. I'm just making a judgment about what people's legitimate concerns are with respect to the introduction of large amounts of private equity into a world to to date that didn't really see, they had for-profit money. A lot of it was driven by Community Reinvestment Act from large financial institutions that was mission-driven with no return of the corpus of equity. It's a different environment. So I think it is a concern. So unfortunately, I have no answer to your first question and no answer to your second question, but they're really good questions.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm also a longtime affordable housing groupie, so I like that characterization. And since starting at Cornell, I've been introduced to historic preservation as a concept, which is new to me. And I'm wondering what the case is for historic preservation on a site where you might be able to double the units if you tear it down and do a new construction project. So since you've done a number of historic projects, what do you think is the value of doing historic preservation as opposed to new construction?
So, so two things. One is just to be practical. With Boys and Girls Club and PS 186, the community resisted tearing it down, like did not want it. And it was not going to happen. And so in that case, either you get an inefficient affordable building or you get nothing. And so that was an easy choice. The second thing is, and this is one of those things, I've been talking a lot today about transformation that's not quantifiable. And we do a lot of really efficient new construction buildings in New York City, where we maximize the site and create a lot of affordable housing. But just like the point I've been making about non-economic considerations and transformation having an impact that you can't tabulate as easily, that goes for creating the kind of transformative project. There is a collective, and Michael makes this point far more articulately than I can. There's something transformative about taking an institution or a building that has unbelievable, immeasurable, sentimental value to people in that neighborhood or in that city, and making the decision to return it to its former grandeur and use it in a way that benefits the community. When I come onto the campus and I see the new buildings, and every time I come here, there are new buildings, they're nice, but there's something about seeing the old buildings that capture our collective imagination and means something to us. Because, we study for an exam there, or we visited with our parents when we came to visit. I think that is a microcosm of what happens in communities when you're able to restore, adaptively reuse. And I think it's not something you can calculate, but we know it's there. And I think without exception, I've done projects, the Compass Residences, which is 8 new buildings on the Sheridan Expressway, 1,374 units, all affordable, reclamation of industrial land. I usually have it in our presentations. Every time I go into the Bronx and get on the expressway going through the center of the Bronx, I get emotional because I always wonder when I pass it, will I ever do anything as meaningful as Compass? And so scale is incredible. In East New York, I was inspired as a 13, 14-year-old to want to do work with EBC, and now we have 2,000 units we're doing in Spring Creek. That's emotional. But there's something about when I see Fortune Academy and its little 62 beds and the Boys and Girls Club and Art Space that moves me in a way nothing else I've been involved in has. And I can't explain it. You probably have felt that daily for the last, decades. And I just don't think you can calculate it. And I think we have to know there's a time and place for scale and efficiency, and there's a time and place to reclaim parts of our heritage and community that are priceless. And we just have to recognize what those moments are And I think it's as simple as that. Although that wasn't a simple explanation. I used to get in trouble when I was a kid if I gave my mother a long answer to a short question. She would say, don't give me, before you talk, that was a short question. Don't give me a long answer. So I think about that every time somebody asks a simple question, I feel like somebody's just gonna hit me in the back of the head.
Thank you.
Okay. So I don't know if someone already asked this question, but I'm from a rural community, and it sounds like in New York City, at least, there's a lot of existing community resources that you can build upon. But I feel like, at least in my rural community, there isn't that many existing community resources that you could build upon. So I know you mentioned you could probably do the same process in a rural community. So I was wondering how that would look like, if any different.
When you say, so you said there's not a lot of community resources to build on in your community?
Yeah.
By that, do you mean buildings, or it's like, when you say that, what do you mean?
In my case, there's not like there's the Fortune Academy. There's nothing like that going on. Yeah. And then in your community, you were saying there's not a lot of water resources or other kinds of, I don't know, structural resources. Yeah.
So what I would say is, it's interesting because I've worked in East New York and Brownsville, and which the images, if I could pull them up, is just devastation. When you look in the 70s and 80s, there's just huge swaths of abandoned building and land. There's nothing there. Same thing with the Bronx. And then I lived and worked in East St. Louis, Illinois. Same thing. And the interesting thing I would say is, although those neighborhoods don't necessarily have particular institutions or buildings in the same way I described Fortune Academy or these 3 buildings in Harlem, I always say to folks that the people I met in East New York and in East St. Louis, that I've never met better people than I met in those places. You look at the devastation in a community, but it's not reflective of who lives there often. And secondly, there's something, the most compelling thing in my career has been, you go to places like East St. Louis, East New York, and Brownsville, and in the 70s and 80s, you see the devastation, and you see people who could have left, who didn't leave, and stayed, and now they've presided over, been a catalyst for an amazing regeneration of these communities. I still can't. I was taking a young lady who's a production assistant for Stephen Colbert through our Spring Creek development in East New York, which is a suburban-style subdivision in East New York with 1.2 million square feet of retail and thousands of units of housing. It's like you're stepping into a suburb. And as she got out of the Uber, I got really emotional because I told her, this is like a magical place for me. The fact that I knew it was a landfill and it was just, there was not, you talk about coming from communities where this was just a landfill. And now in the poorest, most distressed community in the city, you have an astonishing development. To me, the resource is the people. That the people who live there decide that they're going to ignore what they see with their eyes and they're going to believe something great can happen. To me, that's what life's about, because whether you're wealthy or poor, there are going to be moments in your life where you're broken as a human, where despite your money or lack of money, you're at the end of your rope. And the fact that you know people who were there and imagine something better for themselves and their family and community helps you to believe it's possible for you. And so my answer to you would be, are there people there? Because if there are people there, then you got something. And so that's a lesson I've learned over and over. It never gets old. I told the young lady from Stephen Colbert, I apologized because I was emotional. And every time I go out there, I could go out there to go to Buffalo Wild Wings, and I'm in my car in the parking lot, and I'm emotional. To see something from nothing is what development's about. And it never gets old. It just doesn't. That's a long answer to a short question again.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
So I was just curious if I was thinking about art space, and it reminded me a lot about the Ithaca Art House project. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but I was wondering if there was some sort of vetting process for art space of, who counts as an artist and who can take residence there, and just maybe think a lot about how I don't think the Ithaca Art House has necessarily lived up to its fullest expectations, as unfortunately it's become a hub for crime in the city. And I was just curious if art space took a different approach.
So I think folks would say that the Art Space Project has, but I think a bigger question for me. So I did an artist housing project, and financed it in Yonkers in the old Hello Dolly ballroom, downtown Yonkers. Lucille Ball, I think, performed there or lived near there, and it was artist housing with a ballroom. And I did it financed it in 2002. And Michael, it didn't mean a lot to me then. I have a cousin who's an artist, a couple of cousins who are artists. My son is a writer, director. And I've gotten older, I have a lot of friends who are artists. And I hear about, artists are different. Like, you want to be an accountant, you get an accounting degree, you get a CPA. You want to be a lawyer or a doctor, you know what to do. Being an artist, you're adrift. And I start to think to myself, what do you do when I have a son who's an artist? And what do you do if you want to be an artist to fulfill yourself? We're sitting behind a desk and pushing paper is crippling to your soul. What do you do? How do you support yourself? How do you live out your, meet your expectations and reach your potential? And as I've gotten older, and I sort of connected the dots. I worked with Lily A in the mid-90s and did project with the Village of the Arts and Humanities. Then I did the artist housing in Yonkers, and then worked with Art Space, and then went to Cuba a year later, then went back. And I started to understand that creating artist communities, affordable housing for artists, and communities of artists where they could support each other was more important than probably any other profession. And so from my perspective, I'm less worried about the operation of the project, and I'm more worried about how we create spaces for folks to be creative, to know each other, to connect with each other, and exercise their art. Sound stages, black box theater, rehearsal space, galleries, affordable artist housing, campuses like this, so that people who are adrift, who no one understands, who don't have resources, can create. And I also realized something, that being in development or design or historic preservation is about creation. And I feel a kinship that I never did. And so I just feel like the success or failure or operation of a single project or projects shouldn't blunt or quench the focus on creating more spaces. I had a gentrification question from Matt. I'm joking. We talked about gentrification before. He was like, "All right, no. It was CJ, right? Who asked about gentrification? No, please go ahead. Oh, okay. So I asked the folks I was meeting with for lunch, what should I talk about? And one of them said gentrification, and I started laughing because in our podcast, it's been a topic, And so here's what I think about that in a nutshell. So we typically I don't like to use the word, not because I don't believe it exists. I don't like to use the word because I think labels make you impotent. And I'll give you an example. So if by gentrification you mean that poor and working class renters are displaced, you could say that. If by gentrification you mean that I grew up in Bed-Stuy and Harlem and my parents owned a home there, but I won't be able to, you could actually say that. And the reason that's important is because unless you define the problem, you can't solve it. And I always push people who use the word to tell me what you mean by that. And they think I'm challenging the notion that it exists. And all I'm trying to do is get them to tell me what problem you want me to solve. And so I came up with an affordable housing homeownership program where you could actually subsidize people to buy in their neighborhood instead of building a home someplace else. And my response is, that's a solution to a situation where I can't afford to buy a home where I grew up. So my point is that when you define the problem, we can come up with common solutions. But if you stop at just saying the word and organizing 100 people to say the word, it makes you impotent. There's no outcome there. And that's my position on it. Just tell me what you mean by it, and let's figure out a solution. Well, you went far longer than my kids would go. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
A round of applause.
Gentrification, my goodness, we could go on for another several hours. I won't. But that term begins in 1978. 1978 in Baltimore. Read up on it, because it has changed and been redefined at least 5 times to the present, officially. Now, I'm slow in responding to another request. That is, you should all look at the exhibit, which is right next door in the gallery, because it's about to be decomposed, right? And that's from one of my colleagues, Professor Touted. Thank you very much for coming.